Welcome to another podcast from Locker Room Power. This is David the Mammal Samuel, and I'm pleased to say that today I'm talking with Bob Smith, the physical trainer from Team Bath MCTA. Bob joined us in 2012 and has been a huge inspiration to the program, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to him about training in tennis, which is so different from every other sport. Tennis is incredibly messy, with players maybe playing one match in a week lasting about an hour long, or if they win the tournament they play 5 matches in singles and maybe 4 in doubles and can spend 20 hours on court, and in the same way they have to be ready for both. So without further ado, Bob, welcome to the show, and just explain a little bit about your background, where you came from. I know it was Loughborough hockey, and how your mind had to shift massively in terms of the way you train in tennis from other sports.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. It certainly was a big surprise turning up in 2012 into Bath and seeing how tennis worked sort of up front and chatting with the coaches and yeah, for sure it was tremendously messy, and I think I tried to control what everybody was doing with a few trying to down the training loads a little bit and trying to get a grip on how much players were doing, because in my eyes it was just bonkers how much players were training, and then trying to put physical loads on top of that, and it just didn't. I couldn't see how it was going to work. It didn't fit my very fixed mindset at the time.
And also, I know you absolutely love structure and logical planning, which we do have, but it's in the messy way of planning of tennis, because as players' rankings change, opportunities come up, and sometimes what's planned as a training week turns into a tournament week because a player has to take an opportunity that's been given to them.
Yeah, it's a very fluid structure where you need to have a good grasp as to what are the goals, what are the priorities, what's the needs analysis for that player, and a lot of times the physical development of that player is way down the list in terms of those priorities, but at the same time it's critical, and it's trying to balance those two things where find opportunities to do the training, but still they're here to play tennis, and they're here to win tennis tournaments. So as a support service, that's what we've got to prepare these players for. There's no point having a player who can squat a house but can't win a tennis match, and it's very much about that mentality, I think, that you have to adopt, or that I have to adopt as well.
The other thing is the preparation of tennis players for the Pro Tour starts from a young age. But it is very rare that a tennis player actually loses a match, especially in the younger age groups, because of their physical fitness. That they just do not put out enough in matches, or matches don't last long enough for them to be severely stretched. So it's getting the kids well prepared physically for what's to come in the future. Now, Bob, I know you started with some intense monitoring of players, and it didn't go down too well. How has that changed for you over the time?
Yeah, I mean, when myself and my colleague at the time, Tom Drowley, we started like weeks apart back in September, and we were both from a team sport background. We both knew the value of load monitoring in players, and we went about quickly implementing a load monitoring system. Getting the players to fill in RPE and training load and
Could you just explain RPE?
Yeah, I mean, so typically a common way to characterize training loads is known as like the TRIMP method. So it's training impulse. So we're putting rate of perceived exertion. So for example, you do a tennis session and you think it was a 5 out of 10, which on this RPE scale would characterize that as a hard session. So typically we see tennis training sessions anywhere between, kind of a 2 out of 10 up to maybe a 7, 8 out of 10 in terms of their intensity. And then we times that by the duration of the session. So it might be a 2-hour session. So we might times an intensity of 5 by a duration of 120 minutes. And that gives us a training load of, God, is that 500? 600 units, I think. And then that characterizes that session. And it sounds very ambiguous, but there's a lot of research backing up.
Don't worry, Bob does have a calculator.
She's a spreadsheet, yeah. But that then we characterize that across, all the other different types of training, such as strength work in the gym, conditioning work, and there's a lot of research supporting the concept of being able to compare different types of sessions using this method, which is a challenge when it comes to load.
And this gives you an overall weekly load.
Yeah, so we'll get daily loads. So if they play, 2 tennis sessions and do a strength session in the gym afterwards, that would give us a daily load of, let's say, for example, 1,100 units. And then, from that we can look at how the days fluctuate, how the weeks fluctuate, how the months fluctuate. We can look at tournament competition loads characterized by the players. We can look at all sorts of different relationships, which is then where the real challenge begins with load monitoring.
Yeah, and of course one of the huge objectives we have of the program is to keep players healthy, to stay away from injury. And what is the little gem that you've kind of discovered, probably on the back of a long trip that we did to America last summer, where Bob was traveling with us for 6 weeks, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, 6 weeks, and really got to know the ins and outs of tennis. And I encourage any physical trainer in tennis and any program in tennis to get your trainers out on the road together with the coaches, because that's one of the most fantastic learning experiences about how the tour actually works that you can have. It's very, very difficult to experience it vicariously from the training base. So if you can just, Bob, give up a bit of the gem that you found out in terms of monitoring and players coming back to the training base after tournament play.
Yeah, I mean, I think before that trip, I was looking at trying to minimize really high training loads, and and sort of getting on coaches and players' backs when they'd go on these big heavy training weeks, and you'd be like, well, that was stupid, like being the job's worth like that. But I think, I think.
I'm glad we persevered and didn't give him the sack.
Yeah, probably came close actually. I think the big thing that I learned that summer was you're trying to avoid massive fluctuations in training load. It's not necessarily about the high training load, because what we see is that players who are used to a high training load will tolerate a high training load. It's the ones either where the player's not used to a very high load, or where they've had a break, they've maybe taken a holiday, or they've taken some time off and then come back into a very high load, where we start to see the injuries. And that's not I can't take the credit for that observation. There's a lot of research in other sports that's found a very similar thing. So it was a realization that applied to tennis as well, or maybe not a realization, but just a change in mindset that was the critical thing in tennis. So that started me down the avenue of, okay, well, what data do we need to collect? What analysis do we need to apply to that data into being able to proactively plan and advise on training, rather than just retrospectively look back at high training loads and explain to a player why they got injured because the training load was high, and they've got zero gratitude for that because it's not, that's not effective at all.
So in a nutshell, what you're saying is when a player comes back from either competition or a holiday, we are now able to ease them into training and slowly up the load rather than saying you've had some really good time off, now we can hit you really hard. And that has been a change in mindset for not just Bob but also for the coaches, because the fact that a player has rested does not mean that they can come back and immediately hit it very, very hard. And this certainly is something that's benefiting both the players and the program. It has also given the players an added meaning as to why they're doing their monitoring. It's given them a reason to do their monitoring so that they can get this value information, and that the training loads, when they come back to base, are at a place that is going to help them stay healthy.
Yeah, and I think that's when you talk to, especially when you talk to pro players on the tour, that's often their biggest motivation is to stay healthy. And I think as strength and conditioning coaches, we have aspirations for players in terms of you'll be able to lift this much, you'll be as strong as this, you'll be as quick as this, and I think once players experience a couple of injuries that take them off the court, I think that resilience to injury comes higher and higher up the priority list, and it has to for us as S&C coaches as well. We have to put that ahead of any aspirations for physical development, and develop physical attributes a lot more subtly and a lot slower.
And the thing for me as the head coach, it's really important that we instill these habits at a young age, because unfortunately some of our pro players have learned the hard way through injury to now be a lot smarter about the way they come back. And it's a shame that some of this, I'm positive with this method, would have been preventable.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I guess the level of accountability I like to have in tennis is that every injury is preventable theoretically. I mean, if we look at tennis as a sport, the vast majority, I'd say 99% of the injuries that we see are chronic overuse injuries.
Yeah, so unless it's a trauma.
Yeah, we very seldom see, maybe like a rolled ankle, or we don't see ACL injuries. We just don't see contact injuries really, because there is no contact. So the vast majority of injuries we see are chronic overuse. So in theory, every injury is preventable. And if you start from that basis, then with good planning, with good preparation of players, if you start on that basis,
and good monitoring
and good load monitoring, yeah, and you understand what the player can tolerate, then I think that's a good place to start, because then the conversations you have between player, coach, and trainer are one in which, okay, if a player's got injured, then why has he got injured? Why have they got injured? And you can learn from that, or you need to learn from that, so that you don't make the same mistake again. And it's tricky, players will get injured in tennis, because it's you're playing a huge volume of high intensity exercise on virtually on concrete a lot of the time, and it's a tough sport, and they will get injured. But if we can minimise that, that's got to be the goal.
Yes, and there's absolutely massive loads on shoulders and wrists, through serving, through rotating the forearm and wrist to get topspin, and the actual power that they're generating. And of course, tennis is very much a deceleration sport, so you've got massive speed deaccelerating into corners to play a shot, and then driving out of those corners. And this takes its toll on the body. So maintenance of the body is paramount, and that's why you see the top players pretty much all traveling with a physio, having constant massage every single day, and we need to build athletes that can withstand that kind of punishment. Bob, moving on, just if you could summarize a couple of tips for people to implement in terms of load monitoring, some simple steps that maybe people who have not ever done that before can start to take, because it's not, you don't have to be a scientist to be able to do some form of monitoring.
No, I guess the first thing, I mean, if you provided you got a player that's compliant, that is diligently filling in the data, and you can collect reliable
What sort
data.
of data would you want for them? So if we're talking about, even a parent who wants to monitor their child's training a little better, who's a good kid, maybe 13, 14 years old, what are some quick wins that they can have, without, maybe a player is in a program that doesn't have a physical trainer, and they get programs given to them, and they pretty much have to do a lot of it themselves, and parents then kind of become the monitor.
Yeah, I think the hours on court is a good one. While it doesn't give us the whole picture, it gives us like the exposure to tennis. I think the intensity of tennis, you don't get a huge amount of variability in intensity. I know that might sound counterintuitive to a lot of coaches because and players as well, because they know an intense match versus an easy match, but it's the duration. I think the duration of the tennis kind of gives us more information. If you're just going to collect one bit of information, I would go hours on court, something like that. If you can get an indication of like how hard that session was for the player, then all the better. But if you just start to collect even just hours on court in the very first instance,
so they rate if they have 2 hours on court.
Yeah, that's 120 minutes,
yeah.
and then get an idea of how hard that was, and that's if you wanna use an RPE scale, if it's called Borg's rating, Borg's scale of it's the Borg scale, so you can get scales of 1 to 10 or 1 to 15, I think.
So they could Google that.
You can go on Google and find that easily. It's BORG, Borg's scale rating of perceived exertion, something like that. But you can find that on Google easily. And then you just use that. You put the chart up in front of the player and you go, how hard was that session? They'd pick maybe, I don't know, 4 out of 10, which refers to a hard, very hard, easy, very easy, almost impossible. That sort of subjective rating, and it's got a lot of support.
And then would you advise that if a player has had a week where it's been 4s and 5s out of 10 every single day, that they definitely take a day off, and the following week, what would you advise them to do, given that they've had maybe a week where they've played 2 hours every day and done 3 physical sessions after those tennis sessions?
Yeah, well, I think a goal of I guess a bigger support service in tennis is that we're trying to prepare players to thrive under higher tennis loads. So my motivation is to try and give the coach a player who can play more tennis, i.e. can practice more, practice their sport more, to a high level, more regularly, compete and thrive in the latter stages of tournaments when other players might fade away. That's got to be the goal of a sports science service. So with regards to load monitoring for a player, if you're just working with your son or daughter, or the player that you've got, then it's trying to gradually build that training load on court so that you get more opportunity to practice the skills that are going to make you a successful tennis player. And it's trying to avoid big high spikes in loads and low troughs in loads, and just gradually over a period of time is adds, you know, half an hour every couple of weeks, and try and build, you know, from, let's say, 8 hours
Or
of tennis
increase
a week.
the intensity.
Yeah, or
every
increase
week.
the intensity, yeah. And
Because sometimes, you know, kids have a certain amount of hours that they
Yeah.
can play, and that's it because of school. But can you just explain, okay, over a period of 4 weeks, let's say a kid's playing 10 hours of tennis a week and 3 hours of physical, and they've got a figure on their training load, and they're trying over the period of 4 weeks just to pick it up a little bit. You know, at what point is it overload in your mind? Because, you know, that's 13 hours a week of you know, let's say a fair intensity, and, you know, they're not machines. They can't just keep going at that intensity. So what in your mind would be a good sort of, let's take a 6 week period, how it would look with a young player of 14 who has the capability of playing 10 hours a week and doing 3 hours of physical training.
yeah, I mean, you know, in a typical periodization model for other sports, you might try and do 3 weeks of like more progressive training with then a 1 week download, and then cycle that so that over a period of time the player is exposed to you know, what we call progressive overload, or a training stimulus that evokes an adaptation, and then follow that with a period of more recovery so that the player can then adapt to that training load and
So as
adapt to
a
high level.
percentage, so they've gone 3 weeks of a certain training load.
Yep.
Now they're going to have a down week. What percentage of down? Because we know that a massive fluctuation is not good either. So if you could put a basic percentage on it.
So I'd go. I would look at, you know, and the weeks that you're trying to overload someone. Typically, in my mind, I've got like a 10% idea in my head. So you know, this is where you've got a lot of control over a player rather than them going away and playing tournaments and matches, because it's really difficult to do when you do that. But if you're just training, trying to increase their training load by around 10% a week through the 3 overloading weeks, and then in the down week, typically what you might use in a team sport is a 20 to 50% reduction in training load. But the big area that you want to decrease that is in intensity rather than duration of play. So you might still play a similar amount of tennis time-wise, and you might still do the similar amount of physical on a time-wise as well, but you just take all the intensity out of those sessions. So in that way, the player still
Around
plays.
about 50%?
He's talking like 50 to, you want to reduce the training load, the total load, so that's intensity times duration, by anywhere from 20 to 50%. And the player will feel that, like a 50% reduction in intensity, you know, they'll feel that.
Yeah, so as a coach, you use that week basically for technical skills.
Yep.
And not piling on the drilling pressure or high intensity drills. It's a great week to do a lot of technique, and I'd say even in the gym, it's a great week to do, you know, recovery techniques.
Yep.
And you know, more of the, would you say, the Pilates type thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we might take, so from an off-court perspective, we might use that week to, you know, put on our nutrition workshops, or to revisit some of the prehab or rehab programs that we've given to those players. There's certainly no PBs in the gym that week. There's no, you know, we're not trying to make huge progress in that week. In fact, we're not trying to make any progress that week. We're trying to you know,
teach good habits, really.
Teach good habits, yeah, and maybe look at some of the other more holistic education around training things like nutrition, psychology, recovery, and
Locker room power.
obviously locker room power. Yeah. Obviously, we just get the books out and we just hand them around.
Read.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think for on a basic level, if you can, if you can have a grip on, I call it something that I try and work with the idea on now is the idea of what is tolerable load. Is trying to understand tolerable load for that person, and it's very individual, and it really is quite a fluffy concept, but it's if you can start to work with it and build an understanding for that player, then you'll understand when they've overstretched that tolerable load and when they're way below that tolerable load, and you can try and stay within
avoid both of those.
Yeah, avoid both. Yeah, stay within a closer margin to avoid overtraining or undertraining, or at least know when the two things have happened. I think that's the key in tennis is both of those things will happen. So if you go away, if you've got a player that goes away to a tournament, wins that tournament, the chances are their training loads will massively exceed what I would consider to be their tolerable load. They don't break down. If they're reasonably well conditioned, they won't break down with that 1 week of extreme heavy loading.
But the following week is the key.
Yeah, the following week or the following 2 weeks. If you have a player that goes, thinking back to our Easter tournaments, we had young players who were winning back to back at tournaments on a junior level, and they come back in the building and they're fatigued and they're tired and they've got a couple of niggles. But they've just had 2 back-to-back, nearly 20-hour training weeks, 20 hours competition weeks from the week before. So that's massively exceeded what I would consider to be their tolerable load. Would you have pulled a player out in the quarter-final of each week? Of course not. So, it's just understanding and knowing when that's happened. And then, the getting back into training is, we might not start till midweek the next week, and that's a very light week for those players, and you ask the right questions around: are they sleeping? Are they do they have injuries? Have we addressed those injuries before we put them back into intense training? And maybe we start again the week after. So that massive overload is followed by massive recovery, so that we get an adaptive process happening.
And there's some basic recovery skills that you can do at home. I mean, just sitting in a bath of cold water.
Yeah.
I know, you've all heard of course, of the ice baths, but it doesn't necessarily have to be ice, does it?
No, I mean, we're very lucky down at Bath to have a young lad, Luke Vella, Australian, who's just finishing his PhD actually around kind of inflammation, acute and chronic inflammation as it relates to overuse, overtraining, but also the adaptive processes on an acute sort of level, but also as it relates to somebody returning from injury. So, Luke's got some cracking advice that he used in Aussie ruled football around how we use cold water therapy, how we might use contrast water, and that's the sort of thing you can do at home in your own bathtub. Just cold water we use a lot of the time with players, not necessarily ice water. And you can expect players to do that wherever they are in the world. Every hotel room's got a shower.
Just have a cold one.
Just have a cold one, yeah. And that's basic, but it's those big basics that make the big changes. The cold water therapy, the good nutrition, the good hydration are the real big three that we just keep hammering in all our players.
And I will say it is a slow process. Players don't just become amazingly professional overnight, but you keep hammering away, and one day you look up and see in front of you, actually, wow, this is an athlete that's really looking after themselves. But it does take not months, but years.
Yeah.
But that's our job, is to keep plugging away. Bob, just a very short word about how you see the future and what maybe is the next step, which I know we're starting to take tentative steps towards. But just very, very briefly, how you see the future, in monitoring.
So, I mean, in other sports, in other professional clubs, they're probably strides ahead of. Well, I know they're strides ahead of us in terms of how they use load monitoring. But I think the big thing that I'm trying to understand at the moment is the proactive planning of training around this idea of tolerable load from a tennis perspective, but also from a total load perspective, and trying to work with a coach to prescribe total loads, training loads when they come back in the building. How do we get the most out of that player while still allowing them enough time to recover, put them back out on the road in a well recovered but trained state? And I think there is a real art to that, and it's about working, I think, closely with the coach, the player, and also myself in terms of putting those training weeks together and really prescribing what our players do and why. I think that's kind of the next big thing for me.
Would you say, and certainly I've encouraged you a lot in this because I know it's such a big key, it's so important to have empathy with the player and actually get inside their heads. And, just explain a little bit about how maybe with tennis you've had to adapt the way you use your empathy.
Yeah, I think certainly coming from a team sport background, you have like the kind of team mentality. You coach the team, and play. People are accountable to each other, and it's a very different psychology. Whereas in tennis, especially the older players as well, once they've kind of developed themselves and how they want to carry themselves, it's very individual, and it's trying to make the load monitoring system appeal to them. Like, what is it that they're interested in? What is it that they think is important? And that's where you get buy-in. I think in the past, or certainly in the past, even working at Bath really with it, is you hammer the same approach to it. You should be interested in this because of A, B, and C. Well, probably 60% of players aren't interested in that because it's got no relevance as they perceive it to their tennis performance. So I think the players that I've found it easiest to implement in are the ones who love the numbers, and they love that sort of thing. But I think you've got to understand that not all people are interested in that sort of thing. So it's trying.
Well, there's a few people who've probably fallen asleep on this podcast, so we apologise to you, and hopefully you've woken up now.
Yeah, but it's about finding relevance, and I'm certainly there's a lot of work to be done there because I've got to try and sell this idea to players if we're going to provide them with the best service, and you do have to sell it. I think you have to be on top of it, and you have to sell it. It's not an easy thing to get people to do diligently and to be able to then show them the value of it. And it's again something that Luke's doing really well at Bath with our junior players, and it takes a lot of effort. And there's a lot of those thankless weeks where the kids don't want to do it because they don't see value, but you just got to keep plugging away, and he's doing a great job with it down there.
Brilliant. Bob, thank you so much for your time. We're off to the Ilkley Challenger Tournament in a few minutes, where Marcus Daniel, one of our players, is in the quarterfinals of the doubles. We've got a practice day today and match day tomorrow. This is a typical example of a player who's just come off the back of a final and is having to manage this week sensibly. And, hopefully he can go a lot further again this week. But then we're sitting with back-to-back weeks of hopefully finals or preferably a win and a title at the end of the week. But, it's great that Bob is here to help Marcus through the week and to keep the whole thing reasonably sensible, which is hard to do in tennis. Thanks very much for listening. You can find more information on lockerroompower.com, which also includes links to Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram. The book is available on Amazon, iTunes, Kobo, Nook, Tennis Warehouse, and can be ordered from most bookshops. Goodbye, and we look forward to your company in our next episode. Thank you very much.